All right, good evening. Good evening. So welcome to the next lecture in our series on the power of science fiction. Let me move that down a little bit more there. A few housekeeping details before I introduce tonight's event. If you have your program book, the next lecture coming up, the date is incorrect. So Nnedi Okorafor is not speaking on Wednesday, but on Friday, the 24th of February, okay? So Friday the 24th at 7 p.m., not at 7:30 p.m., okay? If you want to double check on our website, which the address of which is in the program book in several places, it's values.utdallas.edu. It's correct in the calendar on that website. If you like tonight's talk and you want to see more of this kind of stuff, please do visit our website. You can sign up for the mailing list, and you can, just by going to the contact button there, just enter your email address. Students, if you want to stay on the mailing list post-graduation, make sure to use a private email address, not your UT Dallas email address. If you really like tonight's lecture, you're welcome to write us a check so we can continue putting on events and even better events than this. Just hand the check to Magda over there. Raise your hand, Magda. We may have to do a few more of these before we convince you to do that. So tonight's lecture is presented by the Center for Values in Medicine, Science, and Technology at the School of Arts and Humanities at the University of Texas at Dallas. You probably figured that last part out. I'm Matthew Brown. I'm the director of the center. I'm assisted by Magda Groman, who's the associate director. The center is starting this year a kind of new 5-year mission, which we call Reimagining the Future. You know, we're part of a School of Arts and Humanities here on a campus that has traditionally been very focused on science, engineering, business, and I think it's reasonable to say that all of those fields play a big role in creating and shaping the future of our society. We here at the Center for Values are concerned about what kind of future are we creating, and how can the arts and the humanities and other critical disciplines help shape that future by exercising and expanding our moral imagination. Right? And that's sort of the overarching theme of this sort of new theme of the Center for Values. This year's lecture series is on the power of science fiction. Right? Science fiction, I think, is one of the genres of creative endeavor, writing, art, film, and other media that really engages in moral imagination, and particularly in relation to the relationship of science and technology to society. Science fiction is not just an escapist genre of literature, although it certainly can be that, but it really it engages in a creative way the kind of questions that philosophers, historians, and other scholars of science and technology in society have been concerned about. This year's series is a celebration, also, I think, of a long-standing love of the Dean of Arts and Humanities, Dennis Kratz, who's very interested in science fiction, has been a long time committed to science fiction studies as a field of academic endeavor, and so it's also because I've been gone most of this year on a sabbatical. God, this thing is horrible. I've been gone most of this year on a sabbatical, so our acting director for the year, Sabrina Starneman, who teaches the much beloved science fiction and fantasy courses here, it's also very, very closely connected with her interests. So I hope you will enjoy this lecture and you'll come back for more. Tonight's speaker is Melissa Littlefield, who's coming to us from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. As you can see, she's not only associate professor of English, but also of I'm going to say this wrong, kinesiology and community health. I keep thinking kinesthesiology, which I'm not even sure is a real thing. But kinesiology and community health. She's the co-editor of the journal Configurations, which is the journal of the Society for Literature, Science, and the Arts, a very fantastic interdisciplinary journal and society. She's the author of The Lying Brain, Lie Detection in Science and Science Fiction, which traces a sort of intertwined history of the creation and use of lie detection methods and their role in the public imagination. And she's also the co-editor of a very interesting book called The Neuroscientific Turn, which looks at the use of neuroscience in fields like literature, ethics, history, and economics. So today she's going to talk to us about brain control, science and fiction of EEG wearables. Please welcome Melissa Littlefield.
Okay, can you hear me in the back? All right. Okay, we're unmuted. We're ready to roll. So first up, thanks so much to all of you for coming out this evening to hear a lecture. I hope to keep you entertained and promise a little bit of Flash Gordon and a few other fun things. I need to extend my thanks to both Matt and Sabrina and Magda for making this visit possible and making my stay here so enjoyable so far. So, for me, the theme of this series on the power of science fiction, I appreciate it very much. Being a science and literature scholar, I think of science fiction as being absolutely central to the production of scientific knowledge in a lot of different respects. And in my work, I'm always trying to think about the ways that those two fields can interconnect, and it's helps me make sense of the kind of the world around me. And so you'll get a little bit of that in the talk tonight. So we live in an age of the brain. Everywhere we look, brains are lighting up, apparently offering up information about us and providing inroads for intervention. You might be familiar with fMRI scans or PET scans or CT scans. We've all been shown a depressed brain, an autistic brain, an addicted brain, a deceptive brain. We've become used to the idea that our brains are accessible, understandable, plastic, and manageable. But our ideas about our brains and the potential control of our brains have a really long history and a complex one at that. So today I want to talk about one brain imaging technology that has received relatively little attention in the academic and kind of media hype about the neuroscientific turn or our neuroscientific obsession, and that's human electroencephalography, or EEG. So you've likely seen the gelled caps, or maybe even worn one yourself when you've gone into a medical office. Put simply, EEG works by aggregating data from groups of neurons, allowing clinicians and scientists to see the electrical potential generated in various parts of our brains. To make sense of this information, we translate it using various algorithms. And ostensibly in doing so, we create knowledge about how, where, and when the brain is an active electrical organ. Now at the moment, and I say at the moment because these have changed over the period of time that EEG has been developed, at the moment we display the brain's electrical activity in the form of 5 wave formations. So you have gamma, beta, alpha, theta, and delta. And I've listed them here in terms of frequency and their association with various levels of excitation or arousal. So gamma tends to be associated with multitasking, being very involved and awake and alert. And you go all the way down to delta, which is usually associated with deep sleep. Now, arguably, EEG has been largely excluded from critiques of the our neuroimaging obsession because of its relative age. It's one of the oldest brain imaging instruments that has stood the kind of test of time as a stalwart kind of laboratory technology, whose controversies have been largely relegated to its past, though I'm going to bring up some of those controversies today, just for fun. Now, over the past decade, companies like NeuroSky and Epic have brought EEG out of the laboratory and helped the technology make its way into the consumer market. So we now have baseball hats and baseball hats and animal ears, headphones, bike helmets, all embedded with EEG sensors. And I'm going to put that down a bit. Okay. They're supposed to provide feedback about our brain waves, right? Now, these EEG wearables are marketed as transparent visualizations of our brain's activity. Thank you. But what they are actually recording, monitoring, what are they actually recording, monitoring, and manipulating, and what are the imagined possibilities for EEG and brainwaves, the brainwaves that they ostensibly monitor? So in this presentation, I want to trace contemporary discourses about brainwaves to both the science and the science fiction of the mid-20th century, and argue that both the science and science fiction of EEG are products and producers of brainwave ideologies, the electrical potential of our brains to create, connect, and control or be controlled. So throughout this presentation, I'm invested in the cultural contexts that inform the development of EEG-based technologies, in science and science fiction, the discourses that hasten their distribution, and the cultural hopes and fears that prompt their use. In the interest of time, I want to focus specifically on the rise of brainwave as a term, and then move on to representations of brainwave amplification headgear, helmets in science fiction, and then the new wearables market. I'll come back around to that. The payoff of this talk is that once you start thinking about or seeing brainwaves, you find their impact everywhere, from conceptions of thought creation to strategies for communication, to ideals of control. They inform our understandings of knowledge production, connections to other people, concepts of individuality, and even life itself. To be declared brain dead, you have to stop producing brainwaves. But I'm getting ahead of myself and beyond the scope of this talk. So let me begin with a brief overview of EEG. So what is EEG? Even if you don't know much about human electroencephalography, most of us use and recognize the term brainwave. For example, it was amazing to see my brainwaves on the hospital monitor, or I'm trying to practice meditation so that I create more alpha waves. Or even the recent headline, scientists found a way to email brainwaves. In science fiction, popular science articles, and science papers, the term brainwave has become a colloquialism for telepathic transference, thoughts made material, for the spark of inspiration, and after 1935, the results of electroencephalography. Now, when I first began working on EEG and the book project that's kind of related to this talk, I had to remind myself that brain waves are an invention, one that capitalizes particularly after 1935, and we'll get back to the dates in a minute, on the construction of electrical brain monitoring and our imaginative expectations that the brain is emanating its status and information in material form. Thus, if the advent of EEG rendered visible our brain's electrical potentials, it also revealed the ways that EEG's inventor, Hans Berger, and now many of us, conceive of the materiality of psychic processes. One of my primary assumptions, and something I hope to convey to you today, is that we can't take EEG for granted as a transparent technique that renders the brain objectively visible. EEGs do not measure brain waves any more than our brains emit them. Instead, EEG, including its newest wearable forms, is a product and producer of brainwave ideologies, what I define somewhat cheekily as the electrical potential of our brains to produce measurable states of mind and be open to intervention. So understanding brainwave ideologies necessitates that we open the black box of EEG, follow the artifact around, and consider its genealogy. Okay, if we were to begin with the standard narrative, one could describe EEG's emergence thusly. Human electroencephalography, the basic system on which all EEG wearables are based, emerged in the 1920s and 30s as a means of collecting and recording the electrical activity of the human mind. Collected via the scalp, these measurements were some of the first non-invasive techniques that revealed when and how the human brain was an active organ. Hans Berger, a German psychiatrist, was the first to record the human EEG, and he wrote of his trials in 14 papers between 1929 and 1938. Berger reported, and I quote here, "The electroencephalogram represents a continuous curve with continuous oscillations in which, as already emphasized repeatedly, one can distinguish larger first-order waves and smaller second-order waves." Berger named his first recorded rhythm captured when the subject's eyes were closed, alpha, and the second recorded rhythm captured when the subject's eyes are open, beta. In 1934, E.D. Adrian and B.H.C. Matthews replicated Berger's results, offering validation to what they termed the Berger rhythm. And it's interesting, of course, that both scientists they actually set out to disprove Berger, but they found what he found, and so it all worked out in the end. Okay. Now, this version of the great man discovery narrative provides only a portion of a much more complex story of scientific creation, and it does so through a particular ideological lens. The orthodox narratives do not, for example, call into question discovery, nor do they question knowledge production practices that solidified into what we now know as EEG. Casting a broader net, as do many historians of science, we might note that EEG's conceptual genealogy also involves psychical energy, the hope of creating a Hirnspiegel, or brain mirror, and that's Hans Berger's words for it in his diary. Moreover, Hans Berger's work on the EEG was not well accepted when it first emerged. It was hardly acknowledged in his native Germany for almost a decade, and he faced criticism abroad because the concept behind EEG itself, that the brain was an electrically active organ that could be accurately monitored, was quite radical. As Peter Glor notes in the introduction to his translation of Berger's 14 papers on the electroencephalogram, and I quote it up here in the upper corner, "The publication in the 1920s of the first paper on the human electroencephalogram by Hans Berger was an event for which the scientific world was not prepared." Berger's work was fundamentally out of step with the science of the time, and the concept of accessing and mapping something as complex as the human central nervous system seemed completely outside of its purview. As Robert Kaplan notes over on this side, and I quote, "So great were regarded the obstacles of tracing the electricity of the brain at the time that anyone trained in the field regarded it as futile," end quote. In short, what Berger was attempting was believed to be utterly unattainable in an organism as complex as the human. Now, despite the authority of dominant paradigms and Berger's own hesitation about publishing his results, he actually waited 5 years between finding the EEG and actually wanting to publish on it because he wasn't certain that he had found something. But despite all of that, his experiments did change the shape of neuroscientific research, introducing a novel means of reading the electrical impulses of the brain for information about the mental state of the subject. In part, this was due to the rapidity with which EEG was taken up in the print news media. As Cornelius Bork has argued, and I quote, "In contrast to Berger's own discretion, the press did not share his hesitation and did not present the EEG as a discrete gesture toward the psychological, but rather as its deciphering. More than simply a means for recording brain activity, electricity had turned, according to these articles, into the language of the operating brain," end quote. So we might take, for example, an article that appeared on the front page of the special to the New York Times in 1935 that begins with the headline, "Electricity in the brain records a picture of action of thoughts. Currents generated by mental processes are transferred into visible patterns written by mind-reading needle, which records variations in cerebral adjustments." Now, knowing about Berger's early struggles for recognition and the possible alternative experimental and explanatory options that ended in EEG reveals some of the imaginative potential embedded in the technology. Indeed, some of that potential still exists in EEG wearables. Consumers can now buy an array of EEG-based devices intended for meditation and mindfulness, fatigue management, gaming, and memory consolidation. Whether or not we'll all be donning these EEG helmets in any kind of near future, has yet to be seen. But today I want to focus on the potential of the technology and the ways that science and science fiction have envisioned brainwaves into visible and experiential reality. Beyond speculative dreams and at a very basic level, that we now speak of brain waves as if they were palpable, explicable, and accepted is attributed to Berger's work on oscillations and the very idea that the human brain might be producing meaningful and measurable electrical signals. Visualizations of the brain's electrical activity are products and producers of brainwave ideologies, and it is to these larger ideologies and their roots in print news media and fiction that I now want to turn. So, well before EEG was introduced as a scientific concept by Hans Berger in 1929, brain waves were emerging in popular and scientific imagination. And these early conceptions of brain waves, and then later the development of EEG, were products and producers of an era obsessed with unseen particles and waves, thermodynamics, and telepathic communication. Therefore, it makes good sense that laymen, artists, and scientists would be speculating, designing, and bringing into being narratives, theories, and instruments to test and record these unseen elements suspected to exist and surround them. Now, so far as I've been able to locate, the British architect James Thomas Knowles coined the term brain wave in a letter to the editor of The Spectator in 1869. In his letter, Knowles relies on the theories of his era to argue, and I'll pull it up here so you can see it. Should it not follow that no brain action can take place without creating a wave or undulation, whether elastic or otherwise, in the ether? For the movement of any solid particle submerged in any such medium must create a wave. If so, we should have as one result of brain action an undulation or wave in the circumbent, all-embracing ether. We should have what I will call brain waves proceeding from every brain when in action. Now he goes on in his formulation to talk about brainwaves as largely in terms of communication and connection, which will get picked up by the EEG wearables later on. So he says, such undulations would vary in character and intensity in accordance with the varying nature of force of brain actions, e.g. the thoughts of love or hate, of life or death, or murder or rescue, of consent or refusal, would each have its corresponding tone or intensity of brain action, and consequently brain wave, just as each passion has its corresponding tone of voice, end quote. Now, in contemporary EEG wearables, designers have ensconced this belief in communication and connection within many of their devices, including color-coded lights that represent different frequencies of the brain's electrical activity that are then translated again into various states of mind. So over here you have being alert or relaxed or multisensory. This is the neurotique sensory display. Now, in his suppositions, Knowles is somewhat ahead of his time. Experiments that would demonstrate the electrical potential of animal bodies and brains did not emerge until a few years later by the likes of Richard Caton, Beck, Neminsky, Cebulski. This is all 1913, 1914. And yet, during this same era, we have a spate of references to brainwaves in fiction by authors who may or may not have ever encountered Knowles' original proposal. Geraldine Bonner's In the Haworth from an 1890 edition of Harper's Magazine categorizes an idea or inspiration as a brainwave, as does W. Pett Ridge twice over in his novel The Amazing Years from 1917. This ideal of innovation represented as emanating from our brains is morphed into some literal creations in a minute that I'll talk about, which extended into the fictions of the 1930s in some interesting ways that also incorporate Hans Berger's electrical apparatus. But well before Berger imagines into being the human EEG, we have a lovely poetic meditation on thought waves from Alma Morgan Kinney in the Segnogram from 1906, and a thought recording machine on the cover of Hugo Gernsback. And for those of you science fiction fanatics, we've got Hugo Gernsback here. He's in the house. On the cover of Electrical Experimenter from 1919, 5 years before Berger began experimenting and 10 years before his first published results. So, in the science fiction of the 20th century, pre- and post-EEG references to brainwaves differ largely in terms of instrumentation, with a few exceptions, including the one from Gernsback. As I just demonstrated, and with few exceptions, pre-EEG references tend to be somewhat vague, to refer to an inspiration or a spark of an idea or the potential for thought transference between people. By the 1930s, as news of Berger's work spread in the popular and scientific media, fictional references to brainwaves, including their existence as real phenomena, began to morph and change. Hans Berger may have demonstrated that the brain produces electricity, But many authors, artists, theorists, and scientists have taken these signals and translated them into symbols for creation, control, and connection. Here, I want to detail several imagined representations of brainwaves from the 1930s until today that use a headset for access and amplification. We've seen such helmets proliferate over the past century in films such as Back to the Future or Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. The helmets represent the post-EEG era as one dominated by discourses of creation, control, and connection. So, I'm going to give you 3 examples. First one is from The Wells of the Brain, a Paul Ernst short story from 1933. Only 4 years after Hans Berger's demonstration of the electricity in the human brain, we have Paul Ernst's short story. And this is at least a year before Berger's results are replicated by Adrian and Matthews in 1935. The story centers around a scientist, Dr. Wheeler, who has invented a helmet and a spray hose to materialize brainwaves into living matter, images that he projects onto a screen. His interlocutor is a friend and witness named Carson. He's kind of down there in the lower corner, like shielding himself. He's invited Carson into the laboratory. Now, the good doctor is very reminiscent of Hans Berger in that he is described as bringing together areas of study that otherwise seem disjointed. Carson has an idea the present experiment has something to do with electrical energy as applied to nerve reactions. Those were 2 fields in which Wheeler specialized, neurology and basic electrical energy, oddly dissimilar subjects. Lovely that as of 1933, neurology and electrical energy are still considered to be oddly dissimilar subjects. Now, Wheeler begins his lecture to Carson by stating, "You know, of course, that each human being is a walking generator, that the brain generates a small amount of electricity, and that nerve impulses are electrical in nature. For thought is electricity which only needs to be slowed down in movement to be made into solid substance." To prove his point, he proposes a demonstration with his latest invention, a terrific EEG-like brain helmet and thought amplifier. Now, skeptical of Wheeler's claims, Carson describes his first look at the apparatus thusly. Carson stared at Wheeler and saw that the professor was putting something on his head. A hysterical impulse to laugh rose in him. The object Wheeler was fastening to his head looked like the many wired things women put on when they get a permanent wave. It was a sort of metal bowl placed upside down in the skull with wires leading to something that resembled a portable radio aerial. "This steps up the faint impulse of thought," said the professor, in a tone that banished all impulse to laugh. "It increases the voltage of thought approximately 1,000,000 times." Now, in his description of the helmet apparatus, Carson feminizes Wheeler, comparing him to a woman in a beauty salon. He also draws comparisons to radio equipment, which at this time was wrapped up into discussions of unseen waves and even telepathy. You guys all know Upton Sinclair. You might not know Upton Sinclair's mental radio, which is probably the best example that combines the then contemporary interests of radio and telepathy and unseen waves. Okay, so in describing Wheeler in these terms, Carson subtly questions the scientist's ethos, even as the move toward feminization makes some sense. Wheeler both figuratively and literally gives birth to thought. Indeed, through his instrument, Wheeler creates images of his brother, an angel, and eventually what he calls a murder thought. This latter image is so powerful that it literally materializes, steps off the screen, and sorry to spoil the story for you, kills its creator. All right, so in Ernst from the Wells of the brain's electrical potential is certainly demonstrated, both as a figurative spark of imagination and as a literally generative organ, creating first images and then real material objects that step off the screen. Here, the brainwaves of old, those sparks of inspiration, are literally materialized. However, in this narrative, the scientist's focus on evil is what hastens his demise. By way of explanation, and before he's killed by the materialization of his own thoughts, Wheeler suggests, and I quote, "Evil thought always takes on more substance. It's always easier to materialize than good." Like many brain-centric stories of the 1930s to the 1950s, the focus is often on what we think and whether we bring those thoughts to light and life. In short, whether we use our brain's electrical potential for good. We might think of Mehrab Birtles, The Thought Translator from 1930, Stanley Weinbaum's The Ideal from 1935, or even Alfred Bester's The Demolished Man from 1952. In each, thoughts are generative and potentially dangerous. and the true measure of a man is how well he can rein in or control the creative potential of his thoughts. All right. I promised you 3 examples. Example number 2 comes straight from Flash Gordon. Season 1, episode 21, The Brain Machine. In The Brain Machine, a 1955 episode of the popular Flash Gordon TV show, an evil sorceress, Zyderine, seeks to take control of Neptune, of course. Now, of course, Flash Gordon vows to stop her. The episode spends a fair amount of time focusing on Zyderine's lair, in which she's installed a brain machine capable of absorbing information from the brains of whomever falls victim to it. In this episode, the captured victims are Dr. Zarkov and Commander Paul Richards, who sit strapped in a couple of chairs with terrifically B-movie brain machine helmets atop their heads. As is the custom, when a villain is about to drain your brain, it's only logical that a long explanatory conversation would transpire. And so Zyderine explains her device to the 2 men, and Dr. Zarkov translates for Commander Richards. Zyderine is using, he says, and I quote, an electronic brain recorder, which is an elementary device, the principles of which have been known for over 1,000 years. Only a psyllium headpiece can prevent the reading ray from entering the brain, of course. Okay. Now, shortly thereafter, Zyderine demonstrates the power of her machine by absorbing the commander's basic knowledge of his own identity, taking the knowledge of his name, and then probing to see if that memory is indeed recorded in her instrument and erased from the wearer's brain. So I want to show you a quick clip from this TV show. And in this specific scene, you're going to see, you can kind of, it's faint, and I'm sorry, but all of the surviving videos of Flash Gordon are not that great. But what you can see on the top of these helmets are brain waves, supposedly. And in the clip that I'm going to show you, pay attention to this top of the screen, which has sort of been cut off a little bit by the aspect ratio, but you should still be able to see it.
What did you say your name is?
Why, it's Richards. Paul Richards.
Open the ray locks and record the setting, ProStar.
Are you all right? Yes, I think so. I didn't feel anything.
Oh, it's painless, a perfectly painless operation.
And I still have my memory.
Really? What did you say your name is?
Why, it's, yeah.
I'll flip this back here. Okay, so as you hopefully noticed, the helmet apparatus features what appear to be brain waves across that upper portion. They flash and move as knowledge is being stolen from the wearer's brain. After administering the first pulse of the machine as a test, Zyderine asks, "What did you say your name is?" And the commander cannot respond. Even this basic identifying information has been removed and added to the deep wells of the brain machine's recording disks. Now here, no matter how much one might resist, knowledge and even identity are synonymous with brain waves, and in wave form, these things can be stolen from you. Now, given this particular brain machine, representation is from the 1950s, Zyderine's instrument certainly resonates with larger brain-related issues of the time. For example, fears about brainwashing and lobotomy, which my colleague Janelle Johnson has covered in her really cool new book on of lobotomy called American Lobotomy. And she talks about a lot of these cultural representations. But also, as Zyderine terrifyingly notes, it's a painless, perfectly painless operation that erases one's brain while transferring its contents to a mechanical recording device. And in this effect, we may consider the rise of the computer, which was also part and parcel of the middle decades of the 20th century. These larger cultural contexts are important indices for the ever-morphing representation of brainwaves at mid-century. As they're imagined within the world of Flash Gordon and in the 1930s laboratory of Dr. Wheeler, brainwaves are compatible with machines which can amplify, record, erase, and create. In both cases, the helmet apparatus makes the interface between the biological organism and the data streaming brain a possibility. All right. Example number 3. Cerebro. So my final example, although there are so many more, comes from the world of the X-Men. Professor Xavier's Cerebro, a telepathic device that allows the lead mutant to amplify his own telepathic abilities, granting him access to the brain waves of humans and mutants alike. Now, in comic universes, backstories and narrative foci can change over time, but allow me to focus on a couple of illustrative moments here, and we'll see a little bit of a through line. When Cerebro emerges in 1964 as a solution to finding a missing teen mutant, Professor X explains the machine thusly. It's actually a complex ESP machine, he says, which I call Cerebro, from the Latin cerebrum, meaning brain. Its sole purpose is to aid in detecting new mutant brain waves to help us locate other mutants, both good and evil. In a later comic, this is from 1991, he explains to Jean Grey and Moira that Cerebro is, quote, essentially a psychic scanning system keyed to my brain waves, and yours, Jean, designed to amplify your latent psi potential and thereby enable us to scan for the mental signatures of mutants, literally anywhere on the globe. Now, in recent memory, the X-Men movies, X-Men, X-Men First Class, X-Men Apocalypse, have each featured a scene in which Professor X's interactions with Cerebro highlight the potential for connection between brains. And in this respect, neither the helmet nor its purpose has changed very much over the past 50 years. The device is nearly always used to locate a specific mutant or to identify new mutants for the X-Men brigade. In the 1960s comic, Professor X characterizes the mutants and himself as having particular mental signatures. And in the latest film, mutants are represented as having a distinct brainwave color, which is red, amongst a sea of blue human brainwaves. This individualization is akin to other science fiction. We just saw a version of it in Flash Gordon, but we might also look to novels such as Jack Finney's Invasion of the Body Snatchers, James Halperin's The Truth Machine, in which brainwaves are characterized as unique, even akin to fingerprints. Now, while Professor X is working in conjunction with Cerebro, he's able to see a new invisible matrix of individual signals, the brainwaves or mental signatures of humans and mutants, and then connect to that matrix, manipulate it, and use it to form new connections between individuals. So in this greatest hits parade through brainwave helmets, Cerebro is perhaps the most recognizable of the machines that I've covered. It brings together control and connection in some interesting ways. First, because of its telepathic psi foundations. Cerebro is a reminder of EEG's past. Remember, I promised we'd open that black box and go back to some of those problems of the past, and its potential future. One thing I didn't elaborate on early in this talk is that Hans Berger believed in the telepathic potential of humans and wrote in his diary about his own experience with a telepathic encounter, one that helped to shape his research in the developments of EEG. As the story goes, Berger was walking to work one day. He was nearly run over by a horse and wagon, and in his fright, he believed that he sent a telepathic signal to his sister, who communicated that to her father, and the father sent him a telegram later in the day. And his explanation for the reason that his father sent the telegraph is because he telepathically communicated with his sister. Okay. Now, as Walpole and colleagues note in their 2002 article, in contemporary usage, EEG has been continually linked to the psi sciences. So in their 2002 article on brain-computer interfaces, Walpole and colleagues note, and I quote, "People have also speculated that the EEG could have a fourth application, that it could be used to decipher thoughts or intent so that a person could communicate with others or control devices directly by means of brain activity without using the normal channels of peripheral nerves and muscles." Okay. Concerns about controlling devices like Cerebro emerge quite clearly in the films for X-Men. Let's see. Concerns, so in X-Men, Jean Grey, Cyclops, and Wolverine have a brief conversation outside the machine's doors in which Jean Grey admits she doesn't have enough control to work with Cerebro. And in X-Men First Class, a young Professor Xavier, demonstrates his own mastery of the machine through a series of physical cues. The film cuts to a series of facial close-ups that indicate concentration, closed eyes, twitching. And when he feels Cerebro intensify his powers, Professor X physically holds onto the guardrail as a means to control his own inner experience. All right, so this brief but illustrative selection of brainwave representations in science fiction illustrates a number of salient points. First, a powerful desire for direct brain-to-brain connection. And this first point depends on the assumptions that brainwaves, as they're detected, recorded, experienced, and amplified, gets us closer to the inner workings of a person's mind. Second, we've seen an element of fear, that the power of reading brainwaves might either create something terrible and unleash it onto the world, or that brainwaves, if placed into the wrong hands, can result in abuses of power, assault, infiltration, invasion, memory and identity damage, or the loss of physical control of one's body. In each example, the power of science fiction is to offer us an inroads into contemporary hopes and fears, to speak back to science by extrapolating outwards, following technological change to their potentially flawed logical conclusions. Now, as I suggested at the beginning of this talk, once you start seeing brainwaves, they seem to be everywhere and informing multiple aspects of our daily lives. And I want to end by highlighting and analyzing some of the latest headgear on the market today. EEG wearables, which have been invading the self-help market over the past decade. According to NeuroSky's website, these devices measure brainwaves, not thoughts. Here, the designers are stressing the difference between capturing the brain's electrical signals, which they distinguish from actual thoughts, in order to translate brain activity into action, they say. The distinction ostensibly makes EEG wearables appear more objective. Data in, data out, with no messy translation from or to thought in between. The thought translators of science fiction have been ostensibly banished from this contemporary realm of technoscience. However, there's more to these wearables and their translations than you might first suspect. The first thing you're likely to notice about EEG wearables is that, with a few exceptions, the gelled cap or brain helmet has become much more discreet. Resembling the merger of a Bluetooth earbud and a headband, EEG has, by all appearances, become a more integrated, fashionable part of our cyborg bodies. The move toward integration draws attention away from the device. It's no longer the weird, wired headdress of old, and toward the bodies that must be disciplined and controlled by the device. Where does all of that brain activation data go? Who's collecting it and using it? What algorithms are being used to decipher the data and turn it into action? Which brain waves will be singled out and projected as ideal, as dangerous, as risky? The answers to such questions are often concealed in the algorithms of each wearable. The second thing to notice is that the range and power of the machines remains quite broad. The wearables ostensibly allow us to care for our bodies and minds in new and more targeted ways by focusing on things like fatigue management or brain training, sleep solutions, relaxation, and memory enhancement. The model of self-care now differs slightly from the earlier expertise-driven, machine-mediated world of brain wave monitoring. And here, we might look back to Our New Age, a comic strip from the 1960s that produced a series on technological advances that might be experienced in the near future. In this comic strip, the hopes for EEG and other body-sensing technology trump the fear of brain-based creation. The helmets and bodysuits imagined in the 1960s promise better, faster, and more accurate diagnosis, among other things. Via wearable EEG, we are still pinning our hopes on a mechanical solution to the perceived problem of access, subjective patient reporting, and the messiness of interpersonal interaction. But this time, it's on us. So in this series that comes from the 1960s, you can see we've got your EEG setup to begin with. Today, electrical instruments aid in every step of medical practice, examination, diagnosis, treatment, and post-operative care. In the next panels, someday a patient will step into an examination booth, put on an instrument suit. A diagnostic computer will receive the telemeter information after checking by physicians. Of course, there's all this mediation by experts and machines. It will automatically prescribe a course of action while you wait for something as simple as a cold where you need to take some aspirin, all right? But she has the brain helmet back on there. Okay. Now, finally, and if advertising campaigns and science fiction narratives are any indication, we still dream that brain waves can provide connection, creation, and control. So I'll leave you with one example. In 2015, as a means to celebrate the launch and popularity of Sensate, which you guys might be familiar with, television show created by the Wachowskis of Matrix fame, Netflix created a promotional symphony composed of 8 viewers' brainwaves. The science fiction show, now in its 2nd season, is about the unexpected kind of telepathic connections between 8 characters who live and work around the world. Although the television show does not deal explicitly in brainwaves, promotional materials characterize the symphony experiment in those terms, right? Binge-watching brainwaves power a symphony promoting Netflix's new show, Sense8. Fans' brainwaves were linked just as on the show. Now, I want to show you a quick clip about the creation of this symphony. And you might pay attention to the language used to describe the brain, its structure, function, various properties, some of the images that are used, from anatomical brain scans to artistic renderings of electricity between neurons, and the visual translation of brainwaves into musical notations.
Sense8 is about 8 characters around the world who suddenly find themselves in contact with each other telepathically and empathically.
So we asked ourselves, is it possible to take 8 strangers and have them collaborate to create something using just their minds?
Eight fans were brought in and exposed to stimuli designed to elicit specific psychological, emotional, biophysical reactions. The structure of the brain is such that it works by the firing of electrical impulses across synaptic gaps. There is something almost musical in the way the brain works. It is a symphony on its own terms.
We started with these headband sensors that record people's brainwaves. They're alpha, beta, delta, gamma, and theta waves. Then we take that raw data and run it through an algorithm that identifies certain patterns and translates them into musical notes and rhythms. Those 8 tracks are then arranged as part of our brainwave symphony.
Fires together wires together in the human brain. So this process was finding each of the 8 volunteers' theme, the minor notes and the larger notes that add to that symphony. You lay them over each other, as we did with the show, going from 1 person to 2 to 3 to 4 to 8, allowing a larger psychological symphony to emerge.
Okay, so the Sense8 brainwave symphony appeals to the ideals of connection and creation that I've been discussing thus far. The participants are invited to collaborate to create something using just their minds. Now, in the promotional clip, we don't see a collective group of people making music in any traditional sense. Instead, the clip focuses on individuals experiencing stimuli and reporting directly to the EEG wearables strapped to their heads. And yet, discourses of collaboration abound in an attempt to connect the participants. Moreover, discourses of creation attempt to make the process of music making into something new. In this cartoon from 1949, which echoes a similar logic, the 65-year-old tagline is, quote, "Someday we may make music simply by thinking it up." Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought that was pretty much how music was made anyway. But you'll notice that in both of these cases, in the Brainwave Symphony and in this cartoon, ideas of creation are reborn in terms of brain waves. In the case of the 1940s cartoon, we're told, if you can read this bottom text, that band leader Raymond Scott thinks brainwaves alone can do the trick. In the Sense8 experiment, it would seem that Scott's prophetic vision came true. However, when we look to issues of control and intervention, another story emerges. Identifying the controlling elements requires that we think about experimental design for a moment. Consider that the participants are exposed to stimuli that are, quote, designed to elicit certain psychological responses. And the machine then read the participants' alpha, beta, delta, gamma, and theta waves, combining them into music using a specific formula. Indeed, the symphony was conceived of like a jazz chart, where the structure of the overall tune is defined and followed, but the individual performances aren't known until they happen. They're improvised in the moment. Now here, Formulas, structures, and stimuli are all used in concert to elicit, translate, represent brainwaves within a controlled experiment. The rhetoric may be that we are listening to the brain itself, that the technicians are, quote, allowing a larger psychological symphony to emerge, or that, quote, there is something almost musical in the way the brain works. It's a symphony on its own terms. But the gap between almost musical and the structure of the formulated symphony is wide indeed, and manipulated from design to execution to final product. The brainwaves do not provide a finished and final symphony all their own. Through the process of design and creation, brainwaves are brought under control and rendered useful and usable. Here it's in the service of what seems to be an innocuous, sanguine kind of artistic goal, but it doesn't require very much creativity to imagine alternate uses for this kind of orchestration. The helmets may have disappeared into discrete headsets, but the brain is still being tapped for signals, information that can be utilized for various ends. So, there's no real simple conclusion for a talk such as this one, because our love affair with brainwaves is ongoing as we define and redefine them to suit our current cultural needs, fears, and hopes for the future. So in light, or in lieu of more formal conclusion, I'd like to leave you with a quote from Michael Rock's recent piece in the New York Times Magazine on the accidental power of design. Speaking about the complex cultural histories that inform the development of various cultural artifacts, Rock writes, "It is only when our belief systems shift and culturally we experience a seismic disruption that we suddenly recognize the underlying fictions on which our designed world is built." While Rox is using the term fictions to denote historical and cultural constructions, we might reconsider his statement in light of our trek through a century of brainwaves. As I've been arguing, through a combined analysis of science and science fiction, we can fruitfully uncover those science-fictional foundations for historical and contemporary technological designs and ideologies. We can begin to recognize that brainwaves are as much a product of our imagination as they are a perceived output from an oscilloscope. We've not yet experienced the seismic disruption that might reveal brainwaves, at least partially, as science fiction artifacts. We still live in a world that values brainwaves, believes in them, creates wearables to sense, record, and manage them, a world in which an ever-expanding multitude of cerebros are always listening. Thank you.
Okay, so we have some time for questions. Here's how questions are going to work. We got 2 microphones that are going to make their way around the room. Please wait till a microphone gets to you. If you raise your hand, then Magda or Sabrina will bring you a microphone. So, questions for our speaker.
I was surprised that you didn't mention David Rosenboom or Alvin Lucier's early work, and well, not early by comparisons, but they did. Alvin did a piece that was hooked directly, with the same kind of context, but went right to drums.
Oh, okay.
And
Interesting.
then David Rosenboom was on the Mike Douglas show with John Lennon and Yoko Ono, doing. If you didn't know about them, you might want to.
Yeah, they're everywhere. It's everywhere, right? I mean,
Yeah,
the minute you start seeing it, it just shows up. Those are 2 great examples. I'll have to note those down. What was the name of the first?
Alvin Lucier.
Okay.
He was a professor at Wesleyan, professor emeritus now, and then David Rosenboom's the dean of the School of Music at Cal Arts.
That's great.
He just recently did revived that work
Okay.
and did a concert in Los Angeles.
Right.
So it's starting to happen.
That's cool.
And it's a little bit more, there's more authenticity to the music, to the actual brainwaves that are happening than that sensate thing seemed pretty, highly orchestrated.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like a collector of these things. Like the more I talk about them, the more we'll find new examples. So I appreciate it. Thank you. It's great.
So, Professor, loved your talk.
Thank
loved
you.
the topic. So, the cultural artifact that comes to me on this topic is the 1983 feature film Brainstorm by Douglas Trumbull. Wow.
Yeah. Yep. There are so many. There's Brainstorm is on there. There's also there's another DC character. I can't think of his name right now. He's kind of like a really weirdly dressed kind of bald guy. And it's not brainwave. But anyway, they're just all over the place, you know? It's like, there was a British film called Brain Machine that came out in, I think it was 50-something, that's similar. You know, it's just that era. They're just all over the place, yeah.
Hi, Dr. Littlefield. So I heard about a study with doctors using EEG to essentially communicate with locked-in patients. Could you explain a little more about what they were doing? Because totally didn't understand.
Yeah, yeah. So a lot of, there's a bunch of different kinds of EEG work going on right now with wearables, and one kind is through these brain-computer interfaces, where you would wear an Epic, and Epic at least is involved, EPOC, the company of the one that I showed you with the black, the one that's kind of indistinguishable from the wearer. And they're involved in helping folks with disabilities have the ability to communicate with the outside world, or there's even been work where they'll have like a prosthetic hand, and they'll have someone wearing an EEG headset, and then they're able to produce, if they're able to produce a certain kind of brainwave, then they'll be able to move the prosthetic hand in a certain kind of way. Stephen Hawking has experimented with neurovigil's iBrain for communication purposes. He hasn't quite endorsed it, but he wears it and he's tested it. So there are actually important ways that EEG has and will continue to be used for things like disability. The way it works is it's a lot like neurofeedback or biofeedback training, where you learn, you kind of train your brain to produce a certain kind of electrical activity at a certain range, and when you produce that activity within that range, X will happen. So if it's hooked up to a prosthesis, or if it's a voice recorder device or something like that. So you're basically, it's a similar kind of thing to what athletes do when they're trying to do brain training to be better athletes. Like they sit and meditate and try to produce a certain kind of brainwave, and once they can do that, then they're supposedly going to be able to focus more when they're on the court or on the field or something like that. Does that kind of answer your question?
A fascinating talk, thank you. It occurred to me with electroencephalograms and reading brain waves, one of the immediate uses was, of course, the lie detector.
Yeah.
When someone is, and you had the deception up there. And I know it's also been used, my son's done electroencephalograms about solving problems. Has there been any research of brain waves when people were just asked to imagine things and tell stories, and relate this to the brain waves of someone, quote, deceiving by lying, to help perhaps unlock some of the mysteries of creativity?
Huh, interesting, yeah. I don't know as much about the creativity research. What I would say is, I mean, to the lie detection portion of your question, there's a guy named Lawrence Farwell who was doing, he invented this thing called brain fingerprinting, where he's using EEG and he would hook somebody up to the machine and show them images of a crime scene, supposedly things that only the criminal or the person involved would have known. And he was looking for spikes in the P300 wave. His research has largely been debunked by a lot of people because the P300 wave is associated with so many other things in recognition, et cetera, et cetera. But his ideal was the information is like locked in your brain, and that if we can just release it by showing you the images, we can know more about you than otherwise. There have been experiments where, the one I mentioned where the scientists are emailing brainwaves, they're actually, it's a 20 questions game between two people separated by miles. One of them has an EEG headset on, and the other one has a transcranial magnetic stimulator. And the person who's focusing on the yes or no in answer to the question produces a certain brainwave, which is then replicated in the other person's brain via this transcranial magnetic stimulation. And they're supposedly able to then read the mind of the other person. So I suppose that could get into some really interesting creativity in terms of sharing knowledges or something. We'll see how it goes. There have been fMRI experiments about dreams, right, and trying to visualize dreams. That's the other place people will go that I know of, yeah.
have a couple of questions. The first one, some of the media imagery from mid-century indicated a lot of fear, and do you think some of this reflects problems of technology that have gone wrong, such as nuclear bombs or nuclear power and other technologies which have been questioned? And I would like to point out my own opinion is that reproductive cloning has been demonized, and I believe it's completely innocuous. So that's my first question. My second is, oh God, I'm having a problem. Okay.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that the fear that's evident in a lot of these narratives has to do with, and back to this lie detection bit a little bit, has to do with, what information, we think of our brains as being self-contained, we think of them as private, we think of them as our own realm of, thought. Like what I think doesn't necessarily have to go into action, and what I think doesn't have to be known by everyone in this room, right? But with these EEG headsets, there's always the potential for communication that you don't intend. So some of the stories that I mentioned but didn't talk about, like the thought translator in 1933 or 35, is about a professor who invents a machine that basically vocalizes your thoughts with or without your consent. So you walk into a room and you just hear your voice. And most of the people that whose brain he vocalizes are pretty much, they're whiny, and they think of themselves, they're like, God, I hear my own self, I sound like a whining child, this is awful, stop projecting me, they're all these different, and they try to control themselves by clamping their hand over their mouth, when really it's their brain that's doing the talking. So there's a lot of fear of that kind of betrayal and being revealed. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, when you showed some of the science fiction images, like from the 50s, one that always struck me that I didn't see was Forbidden Planet. Are you familiar with that? The premise was that this man a professor had discovered this dead civilization on the planet, and they had created this massive underground machine that you could connect to with some little headset you put on your head, and when you were connected to it, you could get all the knowledge of this civilization.
Oh, that's
and
great.
anything that you imagined would actually be automatically created. And that actually led to the death of the civilization because they had bad thoughts, I guess.
Yeah, it's those dangerous thoughts, right? The evil thoughts. That's a great example. What was?
Forbidden Planet, I think it was late 50s.
Okay, I'll have to check that one out. Thank you.
The actor, I think it was supposed to be Mars, but it was probably some other planet.
That's great. Thank you.
I have a question. All right.
Yes. I don't know where I'm looking half the time.
Oh, okay. So one of the interesting things that I got from your lecture was Sense 8, right? And so as a musician, I don't find it surprising that they're able to record the brain activity when musicians of any type, they hear the auditory stimuli and they would react to it in a specific way to produce different types of music and sounds for the audience to listen to. So what I am slightly unsure about or unclear about is that with those 8 people, every single melody that they would hear or create from their minds would be completely unique to them. So I don't understand how would that be like a symphony? Because then they would have to think about the similar topics in concert with each other. So if you layered each individual melody over everyone else's, wouldn't it be discordant, or are they just saying symphony in general to the individual?
Yeah, I think a couple things. So to the symphony part of it, I completely agree. I think the experimental design wants to create this sense of collaboration and connection that doesn't actually exist, and so they're really monkeying with it and trying to create a symphony, which none of us would really recognize as a symphony in the terms that you're talking about. But it's playing on this idea of connection between people just through their brains. And I'm not absolutely positive, but I'm pretty sure that all 8 of them, none of them were musicians. They were just like binge watchers of the show is how they're described. It would be really interesting to repeat that kind of experiment with musicians to see what would happen, especially, yeah, I think that would be a really neat kind of take on this experiment, yeah. And it sounds like you have a musical kind of background, and so I appreciate your kind of take on this, because even, I mean, I don't have much of a musical background at all, but even just looking at it and kind of picking through it, it seems like it's a real forced kind of collaboration in none of the ways that we would necessarily define the term. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay.
Hi, does this technology have the potential to remove interfaces such as keyboards and mice or video game controllers? Or will we find that there's limitations from keeping this technology, from reaching a broader scale? I know it's used for people with disabilities and things like that, but I was just wondering, will there be a time when I use a computer with a device like this instead of a keyboard?
Yeah, I mean, it's already happening now. So some of the wearables are keyed into your smartphone, and they're already setting things up like that. There are plenty of games you can play with these headsets, like Mindwave. You put it on, and then you concentrate enough to keep a car from crashing or get one truck to run into the other truck, or simple games so far. But I think that's the plan, is to hook this up to kind of video game systems and make it a fully immersed kind of experience of reality where you're controlling everything with your brain. Whether that's going to happen, who knows, right? And what the consequences of that would be pretty interesting to figure out. There's an episode of Star Trek called The Game, where, Star Trek The Next Generation, anybody in here? I'm the only Trekkie in here? Okay. There's an episode of Star Trek called The Game where everyone gets addicted to this headset, which is it's a neurological game, and it supposedly taps into all of the areas of your brain that are supposedly associated with addiction and things like that, sexual pleasure, all that kind of stuff. So, and everyone on the ship gets screwed up by it except one person, Wesley Crusher, who manages to see through the whole thing and not play the game and not get sucked into the addictive whatever. So yeah, there's lots of interesting ways that it could go depending on how it gets picked up. Yeah.
Yes. One thing I was really interested in is maybe some of the aesthetic and stylistic concerns of representing the devices that you brought up. And in particular, I'm thinking of the first 2 science fiction examples, the short story and the Flash Gordon, in which there's this gesturing toward the beauty salon in some ways. So the device that is described as something that gives a woman a perm in the short story. And in the second video, the clip, it looks like hair dryers in a salon. And I wonder you gesture toward the feminization that's encoded in all of that. Yeah. And I wonder, in what ways is it thinking through problems of physicality, materiality, or ephemerality, as well as surface and depth and authenticity through the logics of beauty?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right about all of those things, because there is a certain amount of surface and depth going on, right? The variability to just see or read brainwaves across a screen that's running on your head, I mean, that is kind of like an ultimate fear in some respects. The feminization, it tends to be, it tends to be about a loss of control. It tends to be about, in that case of the Professor Wheeler, it tends to be about creation, like generative creation. But I think it could go a bunch of different ways. One other thing that your question made me think of is that there have been, there's a Dr. Roz, and I can't think of where he is, but he does some pretty interesting experiments where he'll bring participants into a room with a device that looks like an fMRI machine or that looks like some kind of brain scanner, and he will sit them under it, and it tends to be pretty much like a beauty helmet, kind of, it comes down over their head. And he's just interested in it as a social experiment, like what happens when people are in that situation? Do they feel like the machine is actually reading something from them? Early people who were working on lie detection were also interested in that, and so they would bring kids into the principal's office and hook them up to a machine that just had a red and green light and couldn't tell them anything, except the kids believed it. And so, talking about surface and depth, that we believe when we see these kinds of helmets that we're automatically getting at something deeper, maybe go somewhere, yeah.
This will be our last question.
I want to talk about the politics of the wave.
Okay.
And I'm just thinking about this because I just remembered this kind of silly example, but I'm thinking about Madeleine L'Engle's sci-fi for children, A Wrinkle in Time.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about the brain it, right, and that kind of communist dystopia where
All
the
the children are
pulses of the
bouncing the
brains,
balls at the same time.
the pulses of the brains, like get articulated.
I
in
forgot
terms
about
of,
that one. That's a great example.
in terms of the repetition of the movements and everybody's doing everything in sync. And then I started thinking about the wave at sports events where, I don't know who thinks of these things and start this thing, but this idea of the wave itself being, articulated in terms of bodily movement.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure where to go with that, but it seems to me like the wave itself is really interesting as a phenomenon, and I'm wondering whether that's, I'm thinking about it in terms of control, but I don't know whether.
Yeah, I love that example from the Wrinkle in Time. I had totally forgotten about the brain is pulsing its kind of waves out into the community and offering a certain kind of control that way. A lot of these narratives that I've encountered, the control comes in when someone has the ability. It's less about one brain kind of controlling others, and more about the potential of someone reading your waves and then making decisions about you or controlling you based on those waves. And then the other discourse of control is about you controlling your own waves, like getting into sync with them through various haptic devices and kind of learning when you're producing alpha or learning when you're producing beta and trying to figure that out. But I love The Wrinkle in Time. I got to think more about that one. That's a good one. It's good. Yeah.
Okay, please join me in thanking our speaker one more time.